I don't think that there is backing down in the face of strange, bizarre exercises of military presence in Washington, D.C., or the threat to do so in other states. I think, in fact, that has inspired more protesters to come out off the sidelines and say, this is completely un-American.
Welcome back to another edition of Covid-19 from Crisis to Creation here on Mentorit TV. I'm Patricia Falco Beccalli, your host. Well, today I thought we're going to look at how did the crisis of Covid-19 really impact the role of the United States on a global level. What about international relations, and what about the international security environment, and in particular there, the relations between the US and China? To discuss all the questions that I have, to discuss all the issues that I'm not even thinking about, I invited back on Mentorit TV Bill Clifford, who is the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of America, a non-profit, non-partisan organization looking after the American public and their education and involvement into, public affairs and international relations in general. Bill, so good to have you back on the show.
Patricia, it's great to be back with you. I look forward to today's conversation very much.
Oh, it's so timely again, even though I think we're about to, generate an evergreen, giving a little bit more of a depth, insight, as well as maybe an analysis of where we stand internationally speaking with regards to the American role as a economic powerhouse and also on a geopolitical level. And Bill, before we get into our conversation, let me hit you with a screen share, and I would like to see your reaction on that one. So let's hope this one is working. Well, there you go. That's not the screen share. This is not what I wanted.
Oh dear.
Oh dear. That's okay. Where are my photos? Okay, this is not where I want to go. There you go.
That, as usual, cartoons, like good art, speak thousands of words in a frame. And what we're seeing here is our leader, Donald Trump, with what you might call a scattershot approach to foreign policy without particular vision, and you see no advisors in sight, and the world looking like it's been attacked.
Yeah.
It's frightening. It's rather disturbing. And like all cartoons, it's hyperbolic. Fortunately, there are institutions both within the United States and around the world, global institutions, other countries that have a say in what happens between nations. But we are in a very interesting period thanks to COVID. And, it's interesting. There are some analysts who are saying that this is a transformational pivot of history, and others who are saying it's not going to matter really at all. Those are classic power politics. The world is governed by geopolitical forces that are long entrenched. And then I think there's a middle ground, which I guess I would say I inhabit, which views COVID as an accelerator of these trends. And because they force individuals and countries and these organizations to act based on new information and new events, they can change the course of history. But what I would say to just get us off on this track, U.S. You mentioned China. U.S.-China tensions were already in play over not only the Trump administration, which heightened them through its trade war, but since really China's rise to global economic prominence over the last 30 years. There have been the economic impacts since the global financial crisis, which have spawned inequality that Western democracies and others in the fragile world are trying to cope with still. And there are, looking at your continent, there are structural divisions between North and South Europe, Southern Europe, which are in play and have been exacerbated by COVID. I think there's a lot of economic nationalism that's coming out of this crisis, and a lot of questions as to whether we're at the end of globalization or not.
Yeah, and we're going to go into globalization a little later on, but let me pick you up on a couple of things you mentioned already. And that is the economic standing and, inequality and poverty in general, where COVID-19 really started putting the finger on that particular crack, which has been haunting societies forever, I guess. And also the political development, authoritarian versus democracy, and what type of leadership really has been more successful in dealing with this crisis and thus gets more momentum even post COVID-19 era. Let's start with the economic developments here in Europe, and then I would like you to comment on the US and perhaps also in relation to China. Here in Europe, we seem to see a clear north-south divide, and that became very clear, the north being richer, the south being poorer, the north being the one having to get more and give more in a potential rescue fund, and the southern countries, the poorer countries, receiving more. So we have that particular divide going on. What about the US, and how do you see it in China?
Well, I think, the one aspect of COVID that has shown the capacity of US power is the federal response with economic measures. You have the fiscal response from Congress, which has legislated and approved by the president massive, the so-called CARES Act, which put $2.3 billion into the economy, and this is through a payroll protection program to support small businesses. This is emergency relief to hospitals and first responders and the like, and it's also, frankly, stimulus checks to individual taxpayers, and they're talking about other rounds of this. So that amount, and also from the Federal Reserve, we've seen a lowering of interest rates to nearly zero. The Fed has said that it was going to, it's going to backstop the credit markets and the banking system. It's gone on a, bond buying spree, and I think that the number there is also about 2.3 billion. So we're talking about double-digit percentages of overall American GDP. But the question is, first of all, is it enough? Is it enough? How long is this crisis? Is there ammunition to do more? Because, of course, Trump had passed tax cuts early in his administration that some thought were both, benefits only to the rather rich in the corporate world and not to everyone. And that there's, like in many countries in Europe as well, we're seeing it in Italy, there's massive public debt as a result of this. So what is left over for future emergencies, or even this emergency, should it go on? The stock market's behaving like everything's back to normal again. But this is the biggest economic crisis that the US and perhaps the world is facing since 1933. There are 41 million people unemployed in this country. The unemployment rate is verging on 15%. This is going to have political aftershocks. Everything that Trump believed he was positioned for, as an incumbent, boasting about the great health of America being made great again, and our companies as world beaters and so on, that is not the case right now. So, and there's really no address globally to the fragile states that are going to be the next, shoe to drop in the crisis. We've been paying attention to the health of the wealthy countries. I haven't mentioned China yet. We'll get to that in the next question. But I see an expansion of global poverty. I see debt in countries in Africa and in Latin America and the poorer countries of Asia, which will not be able to pay back.
Yep.
Because they're trying to sustain the health systems and so forth in their fragile economies. This is where China has a role to play as well, so we may take that up.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what is interesting, what you were saying about the U.S., that all the pumping of money, be it on fiscal side, be it on the central bank side, is good news. The market is playing it. They're looking beyond the unemployment numbers and the economic recession, and companies really coming through with, I don't want to say profit warnings, but definitely a lot of hesitation when it comes to trying to forecast the next 6 to even 18 months. I wonder about China, because on one hand, China's economic performance has also taken a knock. All right.
Yes.
But they had actually economic performance. They had growth. They had growth near enough to 7%. Now it's going down to, 3.5%, maybe 2.8% going forward. That's still much more than the US is expecting and Europe is expecting. So economically speaking, is China still that powerhouse, or is that short-lived what we are seeing? And is it actually strong enough for the other countries, the other global economies that trade and have a certain interdependence with the Chinese economy to feed off that for their own recovery? What do you think?
China has massive resources. It's very wealthy. And yet, I think this crisis potentially exposes the limits of Chinese leadership globally. There is just the fact that there is in this country a debate as to whether a new world order will be led by China or this is going to prove the demise of Chinese leadership, shows that there is really uncertainty about where China goes and the uncertainty of U.S.-China relations, which, by the way, are close to rock bottom right now. But speaking of China specifically, you mentioned their battered economy. There's an inhospitable global environment, and I think their soft power has taken a hit. Why do I say this? They have not suggested that their rather glorious Belt and Road Initiative, which is this very ambitious scheme to provide infrastructure through Central Asia all the way to Europe, and a maritime Silk Road that benefits countries with ports and other economic infrastructure. A lot of those projects, which are not necessarily strategic in their composition, a lot of those projects' funding is going to be at risk because China has loaned a lot of money. They're not grants. And whether these countries that are coping with COVID, that are coping with the downturn economically from COVID, can pay back those loans is going to be a source of concern for China. Trade has slowed down dramatically. Even with the U.S.-China Phase 1 trade deal announced in January, this crisis has, with all the self-induced economic comas around the world, has put a brake on trade. We will be seeing the numbers, but in the U.S., we're talking about a 5% GDP slowdown in the first quarter, maybe up to 20% or so, depending on which Wall Street firm you subscribe to. But a 25% or 20% cut in U.S. GDP and what's happening to other big countries and what that means for trade is disastrous. China has offered medical gear to countries, but kind of with a quid pro quo. And they want support. They want support in global governance areas such as the World Health Organization. Like, you're not going to investigate me. They've imposed trade sanctions and tariffs on Australia for calling for an international inquiry about the origins of COVID. So China has some troubles too. It's not all good.
They do, and I think this is really important that you mention that, because everybody is kind of looking at the situation right now, asking who's going to come out top dog. Is it going to be the US and China? And China is certainly also struggling a little bit with regards to its leadership going forward. I wonder to what extent the leadership during this time of crisis has actually proven the right way or the right level of, let's say, authoritarian approach to handling the crisis. And then on top of that, the same momentum into trying to really get its power in as many countries as possible. And I'm using the word power on purpose, because of the COVID-19 diplomacy, as we call it. And you just mentioned it, they offered their help, they're sending masks, they're sending know-how, how to handle the crisis. Do you think that strategy actually works for them to pivotally change, the hierarchy of who's going to be, economically speaking, the top dog?
I think they're, well, in the first instance, I think President Xi Jinping has vast power that enables him to take chances. And economically speaking, when you're an authoritarian and you have that power, you can command industries to behave certain ways that in the West does not happen. I think we're seeing with the Huawei 5G telecommunications issue an aspect of that, and there is a battle. The U.S. is criticizing Germany, for example, for and really threatening it. The outgoing ambassador Richard Grenell said, if you participate in China's 5G, we will not be cooperating with you on intelligence matters, which is just a surprising development in transatlantic relations. We can get into that, but again, China is probing geopolitically with Hong Kong and the new security laws. This is COVID is acting like actually in some ways a dangerous cover for maneuvers of U.S. and Western adversaries. China is intending to impose these new security laws on Hong Kong, which essentially, breaks up the handover agreement with the UK in 1997 that said one country, two systems. It's very scary for the Hong Kong residents, but it's also a concern for the U.S., which has responded to that by saying, we don't see Hong Kong as an autonomous region anymore. And this is problematic. There are 85,000 American citizens in Hong Kong. There are 1,300 American companies. There's huge amounts of American and global wealth centered in that financial system, which no longer is, if these laws go into place, going to have the same cachet as, freewheeling Hong Kong, rule of law. That will shift, whether it's Taiwan, Singapore, Japan. It won't necessarily go to Shanghai like the Chinese hope. But the Chinese doing this is kind of, I believe, a probe of just how far they can go. They've also just moved they're going to put 2 aircraft carriers staring down onto Taiwan.
Yeah, that was my next question.
Taiwan's a big question here.
Yeah.
Taiwan is a big question here. But look what it's done to soft power. We are speaking, this will air later, but we were speaking the day before, June 4th, which is the 31st anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And here in the U.S. in early June, we have troops and hardware and Black Hawk helicopters on the streets of Washington, D.C., a symbol, a threat, if you will, to peaceful protesters, which has prompted a lot of criticism from people like Admiral Mullen and people like General Dempsey, and these who are no longer in office, by the way, but who are major military minds in the United States.
And experienced enough to judge what that actually could mean or escalate to, right?
By no means am I equating what's going on in the U.S. right now with what happened in China in Tiananmen, or what is going to happen in Hong Kong, where, by the way, for the first time, they will not be having Tiananmen vigils. But what I am saying is China is able to score diplomatic wins out of this, because you saw the exchange. Morgan Ortegas, State Department spokeswoman, issued a very critical tweet on China's move against Hong Kong. And what was the response? China's foreign ministry spokesman, Hua Chunli, said in a tweet, "I can't breathe." Okay? That speaks volumes. In other words, don't tell us about what we do if we're repressing minorities like the Uyghurs. Don't tell us about what we should be doing about suppressing protests in Hong Kong, peacefully or otherwise. Look at what you're doing in your race wars in the United States.
Absolutely. And we were chatting about it earlier where we said, my God, we bet perhaps that if Russia that Russia and China that is watching what's happening in the US, what they may be thinking, and perhaps they'd be smirking at what is happening on the ground in the US.
Well, on the ground here is a lot of uncertainty, if that's what you're asking. It's today we're waking up to what were slightly more peaceful demonstrations nationwide, but the reality is there are curfews in at least 28 states, and I don't think that there is backing down in the face of strange, bizarre exercises of military presence in Washington, D.C., or the threat to do so in other states. I think, in fact, that has inspired more protesters to come out off the sidelines and say, this is completely un-American.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see that actually what's happening in the U.S. is sparking also demonstrations in France. Globally, in France, overnight, thousands and thousands of French have gathered, in solidarity because of the murder of George Floyd. But coming back to China, I think is very interesting that you raised Hong Kong and what China is doing in terms of the security laws in Hong Kong. I talked to people about it and I said, well, isn't that kind of the expected game? Even though when, Hong Kong was given back to China in 1997, yes, one country, two systems, that this is just a step towards the inevitable. And that means that a further reach of China, its powers, and more importantly, its system of running a country between Leninism, one party, one ruler, and the free market economy. And that this is going to continue. And perhaps really the next domino stone to fall, maybe at least in an attempt, Taiwan. It's not going to stop, is it? Whatever the condemnation internationally.
Xi's goal is the rejuvenation and the restoration of China as, a central power, the global power. It is couched in a nationalism, and it is focused on really building China domestically. Militarily, it's a regional power with global ambitions. Diplomatically, and economically, it's very much a global power, a global superpower. And increasingly diplomatically, it's in all the conversations about finance, about internet governance, about health, about security, at least as far as the United Nations goes. Chairman Mao annexed Tibet. Deng Xiaoping secured Hong Kong.
Yeah, and the opening of China to international trade.
Right.
International.
Well, I'm talking about territory.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm talking about the territories. And China believes that Taiwan is a renegade province that belongs within Chinese sovereignty. And if any leader is going to seek to return Taiwan to Chinese administration from the mainland, it would be Xi Jinping. He wants to be, as in his historic legacy, is shaping up to be the number 3 after Mao and Deng. And if he can, preside or give China that world stage, he will have exceeded them as leaders of that country. So there's ego here, but Taiwan is something we should talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Taiwan, and we're going to watch that. And I wonder about, I have a question in my mind. It's been going around for a while, Bill, and I wonder what your take is. Because the system, the political and economic system, that combination that is predominant in China is one thing. At the moment we're seeing, economically speaking, we are seeing, billionaires after billionaires being produced due to a good revving economy as of late in China for the last few years. This is going to continue. Now, more money, more wealth means more awareness through education. And I wonder to what extent, the rising classes in China will question the current regime, and if they see that the only answer they get is repression or being clobbered down, whether a certain amount of brain drain as well as money drain is going to be something that may threaten that regime in the long term. Or am I just totally off? And
possibly in the long term, but I think, and I think like wealthy people are doing in the West of, having their bunkers in New Zealand or their outs, if you will. I mean, there's so much opportunity in China, and the material gains that they are seeing as they've drawn people from the countryside into the eastern part of the country and the cities, and what life looks like and the comforts of it. I think there's a willingness to accept, that as I don't want to use the word payoff. Their standard of living is improving. That's a great thing for the world. And if it's connected to the world, that's very good too, because that prosperity should undergird peace, or at least a lack of outright conflict. I think that they also, in China, maintain such a firm control over media, state-owned media, crafts messages, economic gains are spread and distributed, that you won't see, you'll see protests if it's people dying from pollution. You'll see criticism. They're very worried that, whether it's local discovery or international inspection that reveals poor handling, ineffective handling of something like the pandemic. As Wuhan is locked down late, it's reopened, it may go locked down again. If the officials are ham-handed in the regions, that ultimately puts political pressure at the center, and personalities can jockey and ultimately remove, Politburo leaders. That's a ways off, I think. That's a ways off. But the more interesting, that's interesting. The thing that concerns me is in the U.S.-China competition, where is the U.S.? And this is, the leadership that the U.S. has shown nationally with respect to COVID, you can extrapolate from in many different ways internationally. In terms of overall where U.S. leadership is headed in the face of China, for example, I think Donald Trump is given credit for the firmness, and not everybody agrees that the outcomes of the trade wars are positive. We've had to bail out farmers. It has put a lot of pressure on supply chains that may need fixing anyway now in the post-COVID era. But they credit him with a toughness and that hadn't been demonstrated. China is a bad actor in some ways.
He's an all.
It's not an angel in these, whether it's espionage or property theft or what have you.
Yeah, no, I think this is absolutely. We had comments from Trump saying, this authoritarian, just clamp down, and it's working. That he's impressed by that. It seems. Globalization, Bill, you mentioned it right at the beginning of our conversation. I would like to get back to that one and refer to your newsletter of May, where you quoted the English poet John Donne, and it says, "No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent," which really touches on the question of globalization. Now, as far as my analysis is, we had health pandemics, always then a big question mark, is globalization really worth the risk? Then we had 2008, the financial crisis. Again, globalization, the knock-on effect, whatever happens somewhere in Tennessee will impact also Australia or New Zealand. Then we had 2015, we had the refugee crisis, immigration also being one of those issues that might make globalization questionable. And of course now the COVID-19 crisis. Globalization, is it a good thing ultimately, considering the risks, or should we just have a little bit of a, remodeling of globalization and think, okay, when it comes to the supply chain, when it comes to really handing over all the, supply, majority of the supply, for example, for our medical care, our medicine, drugs to one country, and then if something happens, we are just at a lack of it from a national perspective?
I see globalization as simply a reality, and then there's the depth of it and the breadth of it, and that can ebb and flow. But the reality, as this pandemic shows, is that we are global. We're global in the way, unfortunately, diseases can spread. We are with our transportation infrastructure and connectivity. The China Belt and Road, by the way, is all about connectivity and enhancing globalization. Globalization of the financial markets, globalization of technology and media. There's no turning back from this. There is the choice is, can we move those global elements, those globalized elements, in ways that will expand opportunity, that will create a more even distribution of wealth and income and opportunity. There's so many questions around the future of work that this crisis also reveals. So I don't believe that we are. I think in some ways globalization, yes, it may be in retreat. We've all self-locked down in some ways, but you and I are talking.
Yeah, we are
transatlantically. I think the danger is and again, as I said at the very beginning, there are some trends that have been underway. Trump's inaugural address is going to forever be known as the America First address, and the grievances, domestic and foreign, that he cited in those were jarring and compared to prior presidents of both parties. But it suggested an economic nationalism. It suggested the John Donne quote that you read, thank you, is really about not being isolationist. And I believe we have to remain integrated for problems like COVID, for problems like the climate crisis, which could provide so many benefits for industry and basically people's livelihoods.
Yeah, and I'm so happy that you mentioned that one. That would have been my next point, because you mentioned a couple of things. Yeah, you mentioned also ego when it comes to Xi Jinping and what he's trying to do with his country's extension. And let's talk about Trump and his ego. It's actually not to talk about that. But there are things that are much bigger. They are much bigger than egos or national interests. There are, as you were just saying, issues such as climate change, a common interest, whatever your individual values are in terms of economics or politics. There is health. There are so many other issues like poverty, like food security, like, all of these issues are common interests. So should it really matter who is top dog right now? And in terms of, the individual powers on a global level, considering that we do have common interests that we all need to chip in at a similar level?
It will matter. I mean, I would say we are in a much greater phase right now of international anarchy, if you will, in the sense of there are institutions that all of which need reform on some level, but you hear a lot of talk about a new world order and the diminishment or the departure from the US-led liberal international order. I think that there is still an appetite around the world for US global leadership, should the US want to do that. I mean, you mentioned the Black Lives Matter and social justice protests that are happening in Europe that reflect the power of our common belief and faith in democracy and democratic institutions. I want to return to the notion of whether we're at a pivot of history or whether we're just accelerating trends. You know, from the fall of the Berlin Wall, 11/9, to the World Trade Center attacks, 9/11. 11/9 to 9/11, that period is clearly, there were demarcations. You could say the Cold War didn't end on one day, but the Cold War gave way to a unipolar moment for the United States. 9/11 was a time of ameliorating global power competition because there was NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time for the United States. A common threat is, you know, we bind together and we address that threat together. US, NATO, even Iran, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, all were united to a great degree against Al-Qaeda and terrorism. We've lost that sort of global sense, I think, in terms of the political architecture of the world system. And whether for COVID-19 to be a pivot of history, I mean, we talk about going back to something. We're not going to go back there. We will have more great power competition. We will have more anarchy. Why? Largely in part because the United States has chosen, not because it doesn't have the capacity to lead, it has such a strong military, it has such a powerful economy, it has institutions, values, and social things that appeal or used to appeal. But we seem as a country no longer to have the will. And it's in that vacuum that we see there's no real global cooperation happening around COVID.
So
that would have been unthinkable before.
I'll pick you up on that one. When did you lose the will? Why did you lose the will?
Well, I think one huge factor is endless wars, particularly Iraq, Afghanistan, you know, but related wars, Syria, Libya, and so forth. That's one thing. I think there certainly are the economic grievances that Trump had funneled towards China as being the fault, but he wanted to rip up everything, not just the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but NAFTA, battles with the EU over trade. We're going to, he said in his inaugural address, we're going to buy American and hire American. And, you know, that kind of message prompts other countries to adopt the same thing. It allows trust to erode. It allows for the jockeying that we see. It allows for hedging. And, you know, there's that iconic G7 image of 2018 when Angela Merkel is leaning in with the other world leaders around and Donald Trump is sitting, you know, looking up at her. He will never forget that. And interestingly, you know, we were supposed to be hosting the G7 in Camp David any moment now, and that's being postponed due to COVID, but Merkel said, I'm not coming. The other leaders, Macron and Abe of Japan, are hedging. Yeah, we'll come if you have it. It's going to be postponed. But the fact that they're not having this meeting now, which they could, is, I think, devastating for example, Hong Kong. There is no united criticism of China on the national security laws. That would have been automatic in years gone by. So when you get to thinking about climate, for example, or refugees, this is a very bad time for refugees. A second spike of COVID, economic nationalism, high unemployment. If refugees are massing, is Europe going to let them in? Is there going to be even the tolerance that there was before?
No, especially after what we've seen, with Brexit, with Hungary being less of a democracy. Even Duda in Poland seems to have a bit of a reaction, and that all generated really by the Willkommenskultur triggered in 2015 by Angela Merkel herself, no?
Horrible time is ahead for them. And what we've seen, a silver lining of COVID has been the rapid reduction of greenhouse gases being emitted in the world, so that the international science bodies that follow this are estimating that on average there will be an 8% decrease in 2020, which would be the highest since World War II. Yet that leaves 90% to go, and we're not cooperating. There needs to be a condominium of the two biggest emitters, namely the United States and China, perhaps verging on a, quote, new Cold War, if you believe the Chinese foreign minister. And if you don't have that condominium on this issue, you have a threat that's greater than the communist threat, potentially, of the USSR, that's greater of any Chinese threat, imagined or real. This is a planetary survival issue that we need to come together on.
Absolutely. This is why I just think, this is why I was saying early on, we've got issues that are so much bigger than nationalism, so much bigger than national egos, and that really could create that Cold War in the sense that there you have the humans, and then you have the threat to humans, which is the climate threat generated by humans, admittedly, of course, that could really bring us together and not and cooperate in the long term. Okay, then in order to find some closure on this fantastic, in-depth, insightful conversation with you, Bill, I'm really so impressed. So where are we going? Where would you say are our regimes, our countries heading? I don't want to say post-COVID, but maybe triggered through COVID. What do you think are the main changes, lasting changes you think we'll take out of this, in the positive, but also in the negative?
Well, if I could just speak to the U.S. on one moment, and we've had this conversation before, which I really enjoyed, on such a tragic event, which was the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. If a positive thing comes out of it for the U.S., it will be a recognition of structural racism in our society. This will be an election issue. The protests may eventually fade as people go back to work, as life moves on. But I am hopeful that this will be in our face in this country, front and center, because we have to deal with it. And I am hopeful that the people who are so impacted by the injustice will continue to keep it in the conversation. And they need allies. They need white people. They need everyone in the country learning about this, voting at the local level, and so forth, to make change. That will be positive, and that will restore, I think, our citizens' faith in the ideals of our democracy. But what are the other trends that I see? And there are a lot of negative trends out there. Well, let's stay with the positive. One other one is, typically in pandemics, we see less international conflict. Why? Because to mobilize militaries, you don't have the manpower. You don't have the supply of food and everything that they need, and parts to sustain a military. You have a weaker economy, so you have declining defense budgets, which, by the way, could become a sore point among the NATO countries, vis-a-vis the United States or otherwise. So, in a sense, maybe we will have less conflict, but then you also have the contrary piece, which is a lot of blame and scapegoating, a lot of xenophobia. I mentioned the economic nationalism. I think internally, our countries are more and more skeptical of government authority. If governments at any level, national, provincial, local, are not delivering the goods, the testing, the economic support, the vaccines, education and housing and all the aid that goes with that. If they're not rebuilding their economy successfully, they're going to be challenged. So this is a prime opportunity for economic populists and political populists to divide, to stigmatize minorities and so forth. That would be bad. Fake news can be flourishing in this environment in many different ways. You can have disinformation coming from your own government. You can have disinformation coming from other governments. And we are definitely going to experience that from Russia and China and our adversaries in this election. Why would it be any different? They love the idea of a weak United States. They love the idea of any wedge that separates the U.S. from Europe and a decoupling there. But fake news, I mean, you're seeing, it happens also because people are isolated, so, self-distancing, and you get in your little bubbles and you get news thrown at you, fake news thrown at you. Why are these conspiracy theories coming up that 5G is a transmitter of COVID viruses? I mean, that's just insane, but it's true. And those things just go to show that, you have people who are not going to be critical about these things. And then there will be, I think, let's end on a positive note. At times of crises, at times of historic acceleration, or even if we get to pivot, and by pivot I mean that we will care more about human security and human development than we will about military development and projection of power. If we go the way of power politics, we'll have learned very little. If we go the direction of health, social justice, environmental protection, we'll be better off. But in crisis comes cultural developments. This should be a flourishing, ultimately, of our arts and culture as we deal with human pain. Human pain and suffering, just like love and awe and beauty, are great muses for cultural expression. And so it's a terrible thing to wish for. I don't wish for it. I want healing, but this time will produce some really wonderful thinking and expression in the arts that will tap into our better natures and lead us into a better place.
Yeah, let's hope so, Bill. Thank you so much for all your insights, putting it into context. Bill Clifford joining us from the World Affairs Councils of America. And thank you as well, dear Mentored TV community, for having joined us for this conversation with Bill Clifford. And please let me know your thoughts, as you always do. Give me your suggestions on who else we could invite to Mentored TV, people that live it, share it, and thus mentor it. See you soon.
Thank you, Patricia.